Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 27 of Cool Story with David J. McNeil. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support. This episode features a chat with Mr. Canadian Comedy himself, entrepreneur, stand-up comedian, actor, writer, teacher, member of the Order of Canada, and founder and CEO of the Yuk Yuks stand-up comedy club chain, Mr. Mark Breslin. I spoke with Mark about the early days of stand-up comedy in Canada, the state of comedy today in the age of COVID-19, and the advanced scrutiny of stand-up due to woke culture. We also spoke about the many other projects that have kept Mark very busy over the years. So let's jump right into it. This is my conversation with Mr. Mark Breslin. Hello, Mark. How you doing?
That's a complicated question to ask when one is in lockdown and has been for a long, long time. You know, I used to live in a building, high-rise. I used to live on the top floor, and it was mostly older Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And I would get on the elevator, and the last thing you would ever want to do is ask one of those older Jewish women, how are you? Because you would hear it for 28 floors. Right. So I warn you, if you're going to ask me how I am, this could take up the entire time of this podcast. Suffice it to say, I'm surviving, but just barely. I'm bored. I'm unemployed. I'm a king without a kingdom. Mm-hmm. And if you've read King Lear, you know that's not a pretty picture.
Yeah. And from what I gather and what I know of you, you are a person who likes to keep busy. You're a creative person, and you don't strike me as a person that likes to be idle for too long. No.
You know, if I were one of those people who like to play golf, then I would think, oh, okay, well, this is a great opportunity to play golf. I'm not a very outdoorsy person to begin with. So the number of hobbies I have is, you know, all involve sitting. I like to sit and watch a movie. I like to sit and have a meeting. I like to sit and have friends talk to me over coffee. And, you know, this is very limiting. Yeah. Very, very limiting.
It's stuff I've been reaching out to a lot of my friends back home in Toronto, and the way that this has manifested itself, especially a lot of my friends live downtown in condos, and they don't have a lot of outdoor space and stuff. And so they're really feeling locked in and getting cabin fever and buggy and mental health is not great right now for a lot of friends. So I want to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to chat with me today. And I know
David, this is the high point of my life. Are you kidding me? Thank me? No, I should be thanking you.
It is good to reach out, though, isn't it?
It's
good to chat with people right now.
It is.
I've been trying to do as many Zoom calls with friends and stuff and make sure everybody's all right. And you're right.
But you know what? Mm-hmm. It's friendships have really suffered, I think, during this pandemic, because nobody wants to call anybody and say, how are you doing? Or what's new? What's new are the two most obscene words now in the English language. What's new? What's new? Nothing's new. And then you hang up on the person. So I've let a lot of friendships slip. And I know when everything goes back to normal, I'll be seeing those people again. But I just have no desire to call anybody and yak at them on the phone when I know what the answer is going to be. It's all make work, you know, that conversation.
Yeah. And in normal times, how often are you at any one of your clubs, the Toronto club, just and able to just chat with people and fully engage? Or I guess you're probably out on the town all the time, right?
Well, less so now that I'm almost 70 years old and I have a 10-year-old child. Mm-hmm. That's kind of that's a kind of interesting news in itself, that I could have a child at 60. But and that's a whole set of interesting issues. But I'm always at the club, in the Toronto club, once a week, usually on a Friday night. That's my night to go down and press the flesh and talk to people. And I book comics on that show that I want to have a conversation with anyway. So that's usually my Friday night. I'm there for sure. And then I'm at amateur night on a Tuesday night, once a month. And I try to make sure I go to all my clubs. And there's usually 12 or 14 of them, seasonally adjusted rate, once a year. So I'll go to Ottawa once a year. I'll go to Calgary and Edmonton once a year. I'll go to Vancouver once a year. I'll go to Halifax once, and I'll commute with the local pool. I'll commune with the local pool of talent. And so I do all that sort of stuff. And then I also have a tremendous number of Starbucks meetings with comics and clients, all through the day.
Yeah, and then you've got such a busy schedule. We can get into some of this stuff later, but you do a lot of writing. You teach at Humber. You've got your finger in a lot of different pies.
That just shows you how I'm not really good at anything. So I have to make sure that I have a lot of volume going along to make up for the lack of quality that is in my life.
Yes, I'm sure.
Okay, that was that was funny, but the truth is, in Canada, you kind of have to do a lot of different things to make that level of income and to make that level of excitement happen. In the United States, all you have to do is do one thing exceptionally well, and you will work all the time. If you're a comedian, you're a comedian. If you're a producer, you're a producer. But here in Canada, you kind of have to do it all somehow. I get bored easily. And if I were just a club owner, just a guy who went down and counted, liquor inventory, I'd be pretty bored after 45 years.
Sure.
But because I have a series of other, sub-careers as a writer, as a performer, as an educator, as a producer, it keeps it interesting.
Yeah. Let's talk about the comedy. This all started in 1976. Is that when you moved into the basement on Church Street, or is that when you were over at Harbourfront and you first jumped into this business?
Harbourfront started in 1974.
Yep.
I had a degree in English literature and no idea what I wanted to do with it. All my friends were becoming lawyers and professors, and I just didn't want that at all. I did not want any kind of a desk job or a cubicle job. I didn't know what I wanted. People always say, follow your dream. But I didn't have a dream. So what I was doing was running away from my nightmare. Mm-hmm. And my nightmare was a conventional life. Yeah. I didn't want that. But I didn't know I wanted to do comedy. In fact, people come to me all the time now and they say, I knew I wanted to be a stand-up comic when I was 9 years old. I knew I wanted to be a comic. I wanted to be in comedy when I was, 15 years old. I never even considered that. I never even considered a degree doing anything in show business of any kind until I was actually in show business. Right. And I went, hey, I like this. So I got a job at Harbourfront the first year they opened. It was a startup, and it was the first of many startups that I would be involved in over my life. I find I really like startups. They're really exciting. Mm-hmm. Running something that somebody has already created or that even you've created is all detail. And that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the big picture. And you get to do that when you're part of a startup. So the idea of this place was the federal government bought an enormous plot of land down on the Toronto waterfront. They wanted to develop it, but it would cost billions of dollars. They had to somehow convince the public that this was a good idea. So what they did was they had bread and circuses. They hired a bunch of people to put on shows and book shows, get people down to the site, which was really industrial at the time, and they would all kind of fall in love with it. I had a unique situation of the 24 people who were hired to do this because I was really into entertainment. I went to everything when I was in university. I went to every concert. I went to every play. I went to everything there was, except comedy. I had no interest in comedy, and there wasn't even that much comedy going on. Second City was around it. Yeah, I went to it. Yeah, I liked it, but I wasn't a big Second City head like a lot of people are, because it was just acting to me. It didn't say anything. I like people who said something. So I always liked, poetry, and I liked singer-songwriters. I was really big into the folk music scene at that time because it was a personal vision, a personal attitude. And I loved that. And I had a lot of it myself. But I didn't realize any of this, of course, except in retrospect. And when I was there, I was quite good at my job. So they started giving me more responsibilities, and they knew that I went out all the time. They were all older guys and older women that were running this thing. I was 21 years old, 22 years old. And they said, okay, who should we book? And I would say, well, you should book this guy. You should book that theater troupe. You should book. And they started to do that. And those things were a success. So they put me up in the office. And when the summer was over, it was only supposed to be a summer job. They said, why don't you stay? Let's plan for next summer. And I had an amazing job for 2 years. I had one of the best jobs in the entire country. I had a big budget, and I could book anybody I wanted. And one of the things I started was a comedy night, not knowing that it would change my life completely.
Right.
And comedy was going through a major shift if you were paying any attention to it. It was moving away from, kind of old jokes and sort of vaudeville inspired stuff that was still happening in Canada to something much more personal, much more uncensored. And this sort of just fit with the kind of person I was, and it fit with the interests that I had. I was really involved in radical politics at the time and radical psychological movements, and going to Claremont Experiment on the weekends, and doing all this kind of pass the person around, trust games, getting into the hot tub naked with people and not having sex with them. It was a very interesting time.
Yeah,
we're talking
1974,
1975. And I just loved it all. But the thing I loved the most out of all the stuff that I booked, I found I loved the comedy the most. Now, I had an interest in comedy like anybody else. When I was, a little younger, we would sit in my friends' basements and we would listen to, comedy records. I know you had Tommy Chong on. Well, we would listen to Cheech and Chong. We would listen to Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce and Bill Cosby. And we would listen to all of that. And I used to watch a lot of sitcoms when I was, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, not realizing that this would all kind of percolate and be able to be spat out later. Also, my cousin Victor, my great cousin Victor, bought me a subscription to Mad Magazine, and it completely blew me away. And so all of these things were kind of percolating under the surface, but I didn't realize them. And then when I got up to host these shows, because I was the cheapest guy I knew that I could hire, I started to have a bit of a taste for making people laugh. And then it just went from there. Well, I got fired from Harborfront along with everybody else 2 years later. All my friends who were comics said, we have no place to play. And I, being the kind of designated driver type, everybody else would be, drunk and stoned, but I would be kind of straight and trying to do some business. I found a place one night a week in the basement of a community center, and I called it Yuk Yuks for a variety of reasons. And it was a huge success. It was only one night a week. It was only 90 seats. But about 4 months into this, 6 months into this, this guy called me from the Globe and Mail, Jack Capizza. I hear you're doing something interesting at this community center in comedy. I said, yeah. I said, every Wednesday night. He said, can I come down, maybe write something about it? I said, sure. So the guy comes down. There's maybe 30 people in the audience, and he's writing all night. And he said, I think I can get something in on Saturday, on the Saturday paper. I said, oh, that's great. Thank you. Saturday, I wake up. I had an answering machine, one of the first answering machines in the city, actually. And there were 48 messages on it. When normally there'd be 2 or 3, and every one of them said, "Pick up the Globe. Pick up the Globe and Mail. Pick it up. Pick it up. It's unbelievable." So I went out and I bought the Globe and Mail, and there was a 2-page spread on the club. The next Wednesday, I went down to the community center about an hour early, as I usually did. And there were 900 people lined up around the block to get in. And it never stopped from there.
Yeah.
And then I started raising money to open up an actual club. And everybody thought, the entire media thought, this is going to be a huge failure. Who wants to see comedy? How many people really want to see stand-up comedy? How many people want to see uncensored stand-up comedy? When we first started, not on Church Street, but on the regular place on Bay Street, 6 nights a week, we lost about a third of the audience through the show. They despised it. It
was too much for them.
Because I think they thought they were going to watch, Red Skelton. Right. And instead they got me opening up a real dirty mouth and rubbing their faces in their anti-Semitism, which probably didn't even exist. But for the purposes of this show, yeah, they did exist. Mm-hmm. And that's when I knew we were onto something, because the people who stayed came back. The people who stayed brought their friends. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
And you were the first to introduce something that had been happening in the United States for a while, type of stand-up comedy. We hadn't seen it here before. Who was doing comedy in Canada on television or whatever? Was that sort of what was available here?
I'll tell you what was here. There was Dave Broadfoot.
Yeah. And
Dave Broadfoot is a terrific pioneer in the business.
Sure. But
he was articulating a very small town point of view that I couldn't relate to it. My friends couldn't relate to it. We were all people who lived in condos or apartments and ate foreign food and watched American TV and were really interested in sort of edgy politics and drugs and rock and roll. None of this was part of Dave Broadfoot's world. There was nobody doing what we were doing. Nobody. Yeah. We were the first. But in the States,
Schuster probably too.
Yeah, Wayne and Schuster actually is even from before that, right?
Yeah.
Wayne and Schuster, 50s and 60s. My parents used to watch Wayne and Schuster all the time. And Wayne and Schuster were really good at what they did, but it wasn't speaking to me. It wasn't speaking to my generation. So it was very much a generational issue of people who were brought up on sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 60s. And by the time the 70s rolled around, they were old enough to actually try to hijack the means of hijack the institutions of culture, which is what we were doing.
When I think of some of the big figures who were able to harness Canadian talent and present it to the world, I think of three people. I think of you, Mark Breslin. I think of Andrew Alexander, and I think of Lorne Michaels. Yeah,
and interestingly enough, Lorne Michaels and I both went to the same high school.
But did you?
And so did David Cronenberg. There must be something in the water in that high school. So,
what high school is that?
Forest Hill Collegiate, which was kind of well-to-do, 99% Jewish high school.
Yeah.
The arts were really encouraged in that high school.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself in Malcolm Gladwell parlance an outlier?
Well, I was always an outlier, certainly psychologically. I mean, I've been in therapy so much, and not always by court order. I was always an outlier. And if you want to go back to my personal history, first of all, I was a child born to older parents, much older parents. My father was 53. My mother was 44 when I was born. I had two sisters that were already out of the house by the time I was born because they were 20 years and 24 years older than me. So right away, there's a whole generational, like a cleavage, right? There's a fault line in my family. So that makes it kind of weird. I was living in a house. I was born in 1952, but my parents acted as if they were living in the Depression in a dark, gloomy house with tiny rooms. And, meanwhile, there was pop art out there. And that's this great discontinuity between that and the life I was living with my parents was something that I think was a big motivator to make me feel very different. I was also really short, and I mean really short. I had a growth spurt, so now I'm 5'3". But if you could only imagine, when I was 13 years old, I was like 4'8", and everybody else was tall. So I'm short in a tall world. I'm young in an old person's world, and there were a lot of other things like that too. So I always felt like that kind of outlier.
When you are that child, is it because there's such a disparity in age and in connection maybe with your folks that you have to find your own space? And maybe I've watched so many Inside the Actors Studio over the years. That was I really used to love watching those shows. And the thing that used to come up a lot was how some of the most creative people were alone a lot. Or perhaps the parents, you'd be an army brat or whatever and travel all over the place. And the kid was alone a lot. So you'd have to find your own creative way to entertain yourself. Is that something that was part of your upbringing?
Yeah. I mean, I was brought up as an only child, even though I wasn't an only child technically. And, I was interested in a lot of stuff that my parents just couldn't be interested in because of the enormous age difference. I remember, here's an example of the kind of stuff that I would do. You remember that there would be these I loved the radio. I loved pop music a lot. My sister worked at the Eaton's record department when I was 4, 5, 6 years old. And she used to bring home rock and roll records that I would listen to. And I became entranced with that world of pop music. So I used to go every week on Thursday after school. I would walk the 6 blocks over to the Kresge's, and I would pick up the Chum chart, Chum being the dominant rock station in Toronto. And it would have 50 songs listed. But David, those weren't in the order I thought that they should be in. So every Thursday night, I would recopy the entire 50 songs on a separate sheet of paper according to where I thought they should go. And my parents would bring me dinner in my room, which they usually do that. This was always special on Thursday night. But I think that's kind of indicative of a lot of stuff, of wanting to make my own reality out of it. There's a certain loneliness. I mean, sitting in your room and transcribing every song title and who wrote it and everything. There's something vaguely lonely about it. When we moved out of my parents' house, when I was about, 15, 16 years old, we moved to another house and I was throwing stuff away. I came upon the box of these things. And there were hundreds of them.
Yeah.
Just hundreds of them. And I should have kept them, but I didn't. But anyway.
Yeah, that's fun stuff to do. I remember being a kid and tape recording in Ottawa with CFRA back in when AM was a thing, listening to the top 40, but just recording that stuff and making mixtapes and stuff, and then recording interviews with my brother in our closet, pretend that I was the interviewer and he was Sting, and it was just so fun to do that kind of stuff, and then listen to it back after, and it's play.
Yeah,
it's play. And what we do today is play.
And I wasn't a sporty kid ever. Still not. Don't understand it. Not really. I took my kid to a baseball game. Neither of us could really last. And hockey, that's a national religion, never mind a sport. And I don't get it. People go down the ice, then they go back up the ice. They go down the ice, they go back up the ice. To me, the only reason to chase a piece of rubber around is if it slips off. I just don't think that. I don't get it. I never will get it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of folks don't, right? And a lot of our artist friends to talk to just they weren't part of that, so they had to find their own tribe.
Yeah. I had to make my own tribe. I found,
you did.
And that was true all through high school. That was true through university, which was not a good time for me. I was very lost. And this all contributes to wanting to do comedy because I was so depressed when I was in university. I had a good time in high school. High school was good for me.
Oh, yeah.
But university was not. And I was very depressed, very suicidal. Yeah, suicidal. Not in good shape. And then this thing happened where I discovered these interesting people in show business. And my life suddenly got so much better. So I wanted to make sure it worked. I wanted to do anything to make sure it worked because my fear was going back to how I felt in university.
Yeah.
Where I was
Who were those first people that really turned your crank, that made you want to explore this further?
Well, there was a duo in Toronto called La Troupe Grotesque, and nobody knows them. They were so ahead of their time in terms of media parody, and it was just way out stuff. One guy, Paul K. Willis, very tall and kind of sepulchral, and the other guy short and gay. Just the fact that there was a straight and gay combination in 1976, 77, just that alone was very unusual. And I became their stage manager for their shows at Harborfront. That was what propelled me forward. But I always followed Paul K. Willis's lead, as he was a real mentor for me in comedy. And I'm sorry that more people don't know him. He was very successful on CBC Radio. Michael, the other guy, Michael Boncoeur, was murdered in his apartment by some rough trade. It all ended kind of tragically. Paul got pancreatic cancer and was dead in a month, which was so sad for me. But anyway, a person who was those guys were really instrumental in making me want to do comedy and be in the comedy world. And then there was another guy named Paul Mandel, no relation to Howie. Yeah. Paul Mandel looked like Bob Dylan and would go on stage, and it was performance art. Before there was performance art, he would read his divorce papers and start to cry and then throw sticky buns at the audience. I and my friend Joel Axler, who started the club with me, we were the only ones who found him funny. Yeah. But it didn't matter. Two people find you funny, you must be funny to somebody. Yeah. So he was very influential in where I wanted to go with comedy. And then there were more, Steve Schuster was tremendous. He was this sort of zoned out guitar act, and he was around for quite a while. He was Lorne Michaels' brother-in-law. So if you're asking me who influenced me that were professional comedians at the time, oh, well, I always liked George Carlin. I always liked Lenny Bruce. I always liked Mort Saul. Yeah. They were important to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were important to me.
Yeah, it's, I remember being a kid and I remember two things about comedy. One was that I was born in 1970. So when I was about 14, somebody gave me a tape. It's pre Eddie Murphy Raw. It was Eddie Murphy Comedian. And I remember listening to that, and wow, I was like, just, whoa. It opened up a whole new world to me, and I memorized all of the routine, and I just fell in love with that. And that was really exciting. And then I got so excited about stand-up comedy because of Eddie Murphy at that point that my parents would go to bed. I'd sneak downstairs and go watch Johnny Carson so I could watch the comedians. And that was the beginning of my sleep problem.
Now you see, I hear that story a lot. I never shared that. I never cared. I never stayed up to watch the comedian on Johnny Carson. I remember watching comedians on Ed Sullivan with my parents, and yeah, I liked them, but it wasn't anything. It never occurred to me that this is so special until I started doing it.
Yeah.
Until I started being in the center of it. And then I realized just how special it was.
And then you did it yourself.
And I did it myself. Yeah.
And how did that feel?
Liberating, powerful, full of revenge. When you're a stand-up comic, at the very least, they're listening to you.
Yeah.
If nothing else, you've got the floor because you've got a microphone. The audience doesn't. Not a fair fight, is it? Even with a heckler, you've got the microphone. They have to shout. So it was fantastic for anybody like myself whose complaint for so long was, "You're just not listening to me.
Sure.
You got to listen to me. Why aren't you listening to me?" Well, everybody was listening to me. And what I was saying was so transgressive that they had no choice but to either listen or walk out. And believe me, I had so many walkouts. People who walked out of Yuk Yuks mostly walked out because of me. I was very proud of that. And it was a badge of honor. So what would happen is, as they walked out, I wouldn't let them just walk out. I would whirl on them, make them the center of attention, and scream at them for their stupidity, their lack of culture. I would scream at them to go back to Oakville and, to their white picket fence, blah, 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 and get out, get out, get out. And then I would take out my wallet. And I would take a wad of cash out of my wallet and I would say, "But just remember, when you go, no refunds. The Jew has your money." The Jew has your money. And then I would have the audience chant with me. "The Jew has your money. The Jew has your money. The Jew has your money." Well, you might think that that story ends there, but it doesn't. What would happen is, inevitably, they couldn't figure out that I was actually the owner of the club. So they would write a letter to the owner of the club describing what happened and demand that I be fired.
And right? You had a stamp.
Correct. I had a stamp that I had made up, a nice big stamp that said, "Eat shit and die." The Yuk Yuks management. By the way, "Eat shit and die" was in block letters, and the Yuk Yuks management was in wedding font. Yeah. Because I wanted it to be elegant.
Yeah.
So I would stamp the letter, and of course, people in those days they sent letters, not emails, and they would put these return address on. So I would put it into the envelope and I'd send it back to them.
Oh, that's a beautiful thing. I love that story.
Okay, so so people would think, "Oh, you're crazy. That's not the way you treat a customer." Except they weren't customers. Mm-hmm. They weren't people who were ever going to come back. They were people who were going to tell all their friends never to come back. So what did I have to lose? Yeah. Somehow I knew that many years later, I'd be able to tell a good story, and that was worth more than anything.
Yeah. And, notoriety.
It wasn't for everybody. Now stand-up comedy is kind of for everybody, almost. But it was really a vanguardist thing that was going on. It was like electronica in 1981. And it's just, you had to be really savvy to go to that club. Yeah. Really savvy. And you also had to have a thick skin, which I think you have to still have a thick skin sometimes when you go to one of my clubs. For sure you did. And my mom was talking to me. She sent me a note the other day and I said, she's interested in what I'm doing with the podcast. And I said, here's what I'm doing this week. And I'm chatting with Mark Breslin. And she knew she knew Yuk Yuks. And she recalled going to your club in Ottawa with 3 of her lady friends. I don't know when it was, probably 25 years ago. And she said they got there and the comedian was using the F word and stuff. And it's not what they thought it was going to be. It just wasn't. And fair enough. You have to know what you're in for when you go to a comedy club. It's not for everybody. They're used to watching this stuff on. No, but you know why? They're used to watching this stuff on television. Mm-hmm. And television takes all the high and the low end out. So, comedy on television, on network television, is like Muzak. And that's what people were brought up on. And they thought they would go to the club and that's what they would see. Yeah. Well, anybody who ever went to see Bob Saget, we used to book Bob Saget. Yeah. Bob Saget has the dirtiest act you've ever seen. People would show up expecting to see the guy from Full House, and then he would open his mouth and you could see the shock on people's faces, and lots of people would leave. Television has become such a reality for people that they can't imagine that there's something else out there. Yeah. So now it's changed, of course, because of cable and streaming and the internet. People kind of know what they're getting. I don't think very many people come to Yuk Yuks anymore and walk out because they're shocked at what they see. No. They kind of know.
Yeah. What you were describing about Bob Saget was kind of like the situation in the 1970s where people had watched Sanford and Son and then would go see Red Fox at a club.
Oh yeah,
and get knocked on their ass by his performance.
Yeah, I'm sure. So this is a problem still. A lot of people, they watch Just for Laughs on CBC and they think that that's what the comedy is, and to some degree it is, but to a large degree it's not. And you segment your audience over time. There are definitely people who love Yuk Yuks, love comedy clubs, love comedy club comedy. But then there's other people who, want to go to an improv show where one of the rules in improv is nothing below the waist. You never refer to anything below the waist. That's kind of a general rule, an unspoken rule. Mm-hmm. And that's great for them. It's so good that there's so many different options for people to, enjoy what they want to enjoy now. That wasn't true in the 50s and the 60s and even getting into the 70s.
Yeah. Well, we're at a good spot in this conversation to talk about shifts in comedy, woke culture, political correctness. I remember being in a university in early 90s. I was a first-year student in 89, 90. By the time 91 came around, I thought, boy, things are getting really politically correct. Back then, and I thought, and I had no idea how much more politically correct they would be, and how woke the culture would change things. And while I appreciate that culture as well, because I think there's a lot of things that have happened that are good to be a part of. We're better people than we used to be, but we've also suffered a lot by that because we're censoring so much. How can you push the envelope and still satisfy audiences these days?
Okay. So this is not the first time this has happened. When I first got involved in comedy and I first opened up my clubs, I had a tremendous amount of hostility and political correctness from the religious right. That was the enemy then. And then they kind of went away. And then around the early 90s, Sam Kinison era, Andrew Dice Clay era, both of whom were friends of mine and I would bring into Toronto, it became the feminist left that was the problem. Now it's identity politics, which is leading the woke movement and is very bad for comedy. Might be very good for people, might be very good for politics, might be very good for a lot of things, but it doesn't mean it's good for comedy. Mm-hmm. And my answer to that is I program whatever I want to program. I don't care what the audience thinks because I'm lucky enough to have over 40 years to give my company a DNA that says this is a place where you can hear anything. The audience knows that Yuk Yuks is not the place to go to hear sensitive comedy. It's a place to go to hear any kind of comedy, that everyone will be insulted equally. Everybody has the equal rights to the stage to say whatever they want. As long as they get laughs, we let it go through. Colleges, very different story. We always booked a lot of Yuk Yuks shows into colleges, and we find we have fewer and fewer colleges that will take our shows. I see it as therapy, and I've always seen Yuk Yuks as therapy. I've always seen what I do as therapy, and it's, if you know anything about massage hurts before it feels good. Right? Yep. They press on your shoulder. Ow, 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 ow. Oh, ah. And that's how it should be. That's how comedy has to be.
Well, that's what I love about comedy is we were talking about this the other day, that I think comics and artists in general and are a little bit like astronauts. They go out there to the outer realms and push and discover and look for what's out there and report back to us, and they also let us know where the line is, and we need that, and when we censor people who do that, we do ourselves a disservice.
Well, you're right, David, but beyond that, it's not just about going out into the world and reporting. It's also going deep within yourself and reporting. Yeah. And if you go deep enough within yourself, you're not going to see all pretty things. You're not going to see all nice things. And I don't see why it can't be a subject for discourse. I think it was Virgil who once said, nothing which is human is alien to me. And I feel the same way. You have to understand the context of it if you're an audience member. Comedians are great diagnosticians, but we're not necessarily great healers. So we can tell you what's wrong with the world. Oh, we're really good at that. But we're not so good at telling you what's right with the world. So we're not here to, make the world a better place or to suggest ideas where you could be a better person. But we're here to tell you what really is. Then you take that and you do what you want with it. You figure out how you want to handle that information. Yeah. Carlin was such a genius at this. He was the real genius at this, because you'd go and you'd think, oh, I'm going to go see George Carlin. He's a big liberal. And in real life, that's who he is. But when he gets on stage, he talks about how disgusting humanity is.
Yeah.
And that's a tough sell now. That's a really tough sell. Can I sum something up?
Yeah.
With this woke comedy? I would do anything to raise money for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that I can't make a joke about it. Well, for most people, it's one or the other. But I don't see why those things are mutually exclusive. There was a revolutionary in the 1920s, a woman, and I can't remember her name, but she said, "Don't tell me about your revolution unless I can dance at it." Mm-hmm. And that's how I feel, I don't see anything mutually exclusive about supporting a good cause and still making fun of it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. Years ago, I got involved in a documentary. A friend of mine who's a producer, who's been a guest on the podcast, named Maureen Riley, was involved in producing a documentary about the Nubian Night.
Yes.
You guys have done forever. And so she called me up and she said, we've got so much material for this documentary on this Nubian Night, legendary night for comics color. And she asked me, she goes, just go through all this material and tell me what you love and help me get the material sort of into a manageable amount of stuff that we can fit into this thing. And it was so much fun to go through all that material. And you were way ahead of the curve on that. Tell me about that.
All right. Well, first, let me say that when we started Yuk Yuks back in 1976, all the comics were from different ethnic groups. That you didn't find that anywhere else. You didn't find that at Second City for sure. It was lily white, but there was a Sri Lankan comic, there was a Jewish comic, there was a Greek comic, there were a couple of Italian comics, there was an Asian comic. We didn't even think of anything of that. The word multicultural hadn't even been invented yet. And because you didn't have to go to theater school to be on a Yuk Yuks stage, we took people off the street who simply said, "I'm funny, watch me." And if they were, we'd bring them back. And if they weren't, they didn't. So Yuk Yuks was always the place that represented that new Toronto, the Toronto that was multicultural. And then that Kenny's show started because I was looking at people on an amateur night, and I passed on this girl a number of times, and she was Black. And she said to me, Mark, with all due respect, how do you think as a white guy you can judge my comedy? And I thought about that for a bit. And I said, well, yeah, maybe you should have maybe we should do like your own show. And she started the show. But I said, you got to have Kenny Robinson as part of it because he knows more than anybody. And then she kind of disappeared and it became completely Kenny's show within like a couple of months.
Yeah. And
it's been a huge, huge, huge success. But our roots in multiculturalism precede that.
One guy that I think about when I think about comedians who've really opened the door to new audiences is Russell Peters.
Yeah.
It seems like when he hit the scene, he really seemed to open up to all kinds of audience.
All kinds of comedians too. After Russell's success, we were inundated with people from South Asia. So who wanted to be comics. He kicked open the door for an awful lot of other people like him, which was exciting. But here's something interesting. I think you'll find interesting. I was trying to help Russell get some kind of American exposure, and he had a gig at Just for Laughs. So I went to a number of major agencies and said, you got to see this guy. I was right about other people. I think I'm right about him. And they went to see him. And I said, okay, what'd you think? They said, well, yeah, he's funny, but what is he? He's not Black. He's not white. And he's not Mexican. He's not Hispanic. And because they couldn't pigeonhole him, they all passed on him. Well, of course, I mean, you know who had the last laugh there, but that's how America saw it. Canada was more open to the fact that he was from a culture that wasn't one of the, big three.
Mm-hmm. Russell's career really kind of blew up because of stuff that was posted on YouTube, right?
That's right.
People from all over the world seeing this guy, a brown comic, do his thing and blow up. That pulled so many new people into the clubs, right?
It did. Although, at that point he was starting to work all over the world because they'd never seen stand-up comedy in Jakarta.
Yeah.
So it was something completely new for them. Yeah. And this was, the genius of Russell Peters realizing you don't have to. There's a lot more people outside North America than there are in North America.
Yeah.
And, Jakarta and Malaysia and all these places that you would never think of if you were a stand-up comic were open to Russell that were not open to anybody else.
Yeah. So he's one of those people that came into the Yuk Yuks fold that, you helped along the way. Who were the other people that you're really proud that you helped mentor or create a platform for?
Right from the beginning, Howie Mandel and Jim Carrey were our big stars.
Yeah.
And both, of course, have gone on to superstardom. And they went pretty fast. I mean, Mandel showed up in 78. Jim Carrey showed up in 78. By 81, Carrey was a star. And by 82, Mandel was a star. So that was all very fast. But then I'm also proud of Norm Macdonald, who I think is an amazing comic, an amazing writer. I never had an interaction with Seth Rogen because he was out in Vancouver. So he kind of went through Yuk Yuks and I never actually even met him because he moved away to the States really fast. But I guess we could take some credit for him too. There's Jeremy Hotz. There's Harlan Williams. There's John Doerr. And although those people aren't superstars, they're definitely way up there in the comedy firmament.
I was telling you this before. I started at Ottawa U in '89, and back in the day, Yuk Yuks used to do student night at clubs, and I think it was $4. I don't know if it was a Tuesday or Thursday or whatever it was, but I remember going to see two shows that I will never forget. One was I saw Norm Macdonald when he first started, and Harlan Williams. And those two guys just blew my mind. And I couldn't believe it. We got to see them at Ottawa U at the Equinox Bar, which isn't there anymore. Unfortunately, I looked it up the other day. And that was such an amazing experience. And wow, what a treat. So that was such an amazing thing that you were doing.
Well, you know who else I should put on that list, though, is Mike Macdonald.
Yeah, Mike Macdonald. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, most Canadian comics, even Mandel and Carrey will tell you that Mike Macdonald is the best stand-up comic that this country has ever produced. Mm-hmm. I mean, here's this guy could do 3 hours and then come back the next night and do a completely different 3 hours. He was just a genius. And unfortunately, a whole bunch of things happened that prevented him from becoming, a big superstar. Mm-hmm. But anybody who ever saw him realized just how amazing he was.
Yeah, I remember
amazing.
I bought a book probably 20 years ago plus. Andrew Clark, Stand and Deliver. Remember reading his book, and he talked a lot about Mike Macdonald.
I mean, it's very sad. Mike died about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Very sad.
And he had been sick for a long time, and there were a lot of campaigns mounted to help him with his treatments and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very sad.
A lot of the folks that I know who've been doing stand-up for a long time always talk about how he was supposed to be the guy, but
he was the legend and he deserved to be a legend. Unfortunately, he didn't look televisable. Mm-hmm. He had a waxy face and he looked old, even though he wasn't old. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of drug problems, and then he became very religious. All of these things get in the way. Yeah. So it's just too bad that it didn't take off for him because he was the guy.
Yeah. One of the other guys I remember seeing in clubs in the early days, which he really was fun to watch, was Derek Edwards.
Derek was great. Derek was so precise in his use of language. Mm. There was never a word out of place in any of his routines. Derek also never became famous because he never wanted to go to the States, and you can only become so well known in this country. And I don't know, I haven't heard from Derek in a long time. I don't know if he's retired or semi-retired or what, but he doesn't do a lot.
Two other people that I'll mention too, and one of them I came across while I was doing some research on you was you were doing an interview, and interviewer asked you, who's a comedian we should look out for? And you suggested that audiences should look out for Aaron Berg. And I was like, I know Aaron Berg. Before he was a comedian, I used to study at Second City, and he was one of the guys that I was knocking around with over at Second City in their program. And then he got into stand-up comedy, and he took off really quickly.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't that quick. But you know what he had done was he did a show. He actually had a show that was sort of like a one-man show, and then we would do excerpts of it on whatever night he was on the show at Yuk Yuks. So he would do, a 10-minute piece. But the whole show was designed as an off-Broadway show, and I produced it for him off-Broadway twice. Mm-hmm. It did quite well. He moved to New York, and I expected him to just blow up big, but he's been getting famous one fan at a time. But if you see what he does now, which is almost all crowd work, it's brilliant, brilliant stuff. You can hear him often on a show called The David Feldman Show, mm-hmm. which is a podcast out of New York, which is on Mondays between like 6 and midnight. Go on, and you'll be able to hear what he does. It's brilliant stuff. I
watched one of his bits that he had done. I don't know how long ago it was at Gotham. And the funny thing about him was that while I still kind of knew him before he took off for New York and stuff, he got big into bodybuilding, and he was in all of that. And that was a big part of his act. And I remember thinking, I don't know if that's going to work, because people don't really connect bodybuilders with comedians. I remember when Joe Piscopo started working,
that's right,
bodybuilding. It was like, I don't know if people connect, but he made it work. Like, he
made it work. And, Joe Rogan is a bit of a bodybuilder.
Oh, big time.
So, so it's not that unusual. It would have been unusual the days of the Ed Sullivan Show, when, these sort of warty middle-aged guys would sort of walk out half drunk onto the front of the microphone. But things have changed now. There's a kind of macho quality to certain male comedians that did not exist previously.
Well, even when Aaron was doing it in the early days, that was not a thing that nobody else was doing it. So he was
nobody else was doing. He was unique, very unique. Still is.
Yeah. Another individual that was part of my growing up when I was going to Algonquin College, and I studied at Ottawa U, and then after I graduated, I figured wasn't ready to jump into the workforce. I wanted to study a bit more and learn some more stuff. So I went and I studied broadcasting at Algonquin College in Ottawa. And one of my peers was Tom Green, and he developed the Tom Green Show. At the time, he was a rapper. He had actually been nominated for a Juno Award as a rapper. And so he all of a sudden he was in our class, and we knew who he was from the rap world. But he was obviously very interested in comedy. He'd done some radio, and he launched the Tom Green Show while we were studying at Algonquin College, and the kids who were in my class were the crew, and they shot that at Rogers 22 back in the day. And as they say, the rest is history. And he's done a lot of different things, but at one point he decided he wanted to do stand up, and I was watching a piece of a video about COVID-19 and everything that was going on with that, and there was a lot of different interviews, and they interviewed Tom Green, and they were talking about how you were a big part of him becoming a stand-up comic. He had done it a bit before when he was a younger person, but then he got into TV, and then he's obviously come back to it. And now that's a big part of his life now in non-COVID times. He travels the world and he does stand-up. What are your memories of seeing him early on?
Well, Tom Green he's a cat. He's got more lives than anybody else. Mm-hmm. He'll rap, that'll sort of die out for a bit, so he'll become a stand-up for a while, then he'll do a movie, then he'll do a blog, he'll do it from his basement. He doesn't care. He's just really good at keeping in touch with his public, and that's fantastic. What people don't realize about Tom, because they know him from that crazy show mostly, is that he's a good stand-up comic. He's a very good stand-up comic. We've booked him as a headliner many times. I had him host our New Year's show at Massey Hall, which is not an easy gig to do, because you're in front of 2,800 people, and it's New Year's Eve, and they expect a lot. But he did it great. He was fantastic.
Yeah, the other thing about Tom that's interesting is he's always been way ahead of the curve on technology.
Yes, that's right.
He was doing almost like, the late night comedy shows out of his place in Hollywood Hills 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Just about, he was doing that before anybody else was doing it. It's amazing.
No, Tom is a real innovator. And, you could say that Tom invented reality comedy. Long before Jackass, there was Tom Green.
Well, yeah, I would not even say reality comedy, but reality TV. And I remember one of the banes of my existence was when I got to Toronto, I was pitching all these different comedy shows, and I'd go and talk to people at the Comedy Channel, and they'd say, this is too big. There's too many characters. This is too expensive. We want what Tom Green offers, and it was like, well, okay, all right, let me reset. But all the old, sort of norms about what a comedy show could be went out the door. And that was both, I was like impressed by that, but it was also very frustrating because, comedy got very cheap.
And in many ways still is.
Yeah, but that's a whole different story. Tell me a bit about how you got involved with working with Humber College and their comedy program.
Well, there was the dean at the time, this was 15 years ago, Joe Curtis, was a real visionary and came to me and said, and I'd never met him before. He just called me out of the blue and said, can we have a coffee? And he said, we have this jazz program at Humber and it's really successful. Is there any way we could do for comedy what we've done for jazz? Create an actual program. I said, well, I guess the issue is, can you teach people to be funny? And a lot of people will think, no, you can't. So why don't we rephrase that and ask ourselves the question, can you teach people to be funnier?
Yeah.
So whatever they're coming into the program with, whatever level of natural ability, we can amplify that. If you're not funny at all, you're probably not going to graduate with high marks. But if you're funny, we can make you funnier. And we had the best people that we hired at the time. We had Joe Flaherty from SCTV was a teacher, and Ann Beats, who recently died, unfortunately. We have Robin Duke from Saturday Night Live. We had Larry Horowitz, and Horowitz is the dean of Canadian stand-up. This guy is the technician and dates back all the way to, to Harbourfront with me. It's in its 20th year, and it's doing great. COVID has kind of gotten in the way because the students can't interact with each other. They have to do it online. Can you imagine doing improv online? But that's going to change.
What are the first couple pieces of advice that you give to new comedy students?
Well, the most important thing is originality. One of the problems with young comics is that they all live a similar life. They all sit in front of the TV. They all eat the same food. And so there's a certain sameness to it all. Mm-hmm. They have to break out of that sameness and find things about themselves that are unlike anybody else. And that's the first key to comedy. The second thing they have to do is realize that all comedy is based on character. You think of somebody like Jack Benny, who could say so much just by putting his hand on his cheek and resting it on his elbow, and it spoke volumes. So character is the most important thing. And I always ask them, are you a sad clown? Are you a happy clown? Are you an angry clown? What kind of clown are you? And they have to find that out. And that sometimes can take a decade. And then they have to learn how to play to the back of the room, because so often young comics are learning their craft in 20-seat bars. And that's just not reality of the performance situation. You need a certain number of people in a room to create the number of people that will create that sort of performance space. I would say 150 people is the right number. Could be 200. Can't be much less. Can't be too much more either, because then that's a concert, and you're not learning anything in a concert because you're too busy just corralling the room. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that I tell them. I also watch them individually and, work, and I'll go, okay, you're too slow. You gotta speed it up. You gotta speed it up. Then the next person will show up and she'll show me her work, and I'll go, no, you gotta slow it down. You gotta slow it down. So you have to taper every single critique to the person's own individual work. There are no real rules, because if there were rules, Stephen Wright would never have become a star.
Yeah. And is that the same advice you'd give to anybody who showed up for amateur night at Yuk Yuks?
Well, I generally don't give advice to people who show up at amateur night because they don't deserve advice yet. Mm-hmm. The first 500 times don't even count. You're just learning who you are on stage. It's later on in the process where I might get involved, because for somebody to go up once and for me to give them some advice, it's meaningless. Mm-hmm. Just meaningless. They have to do it a lot. Then I'll give them advice.
And they have to find their own voice first.
Yeah. Or at least think they found their own voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned Stephen Wright. and he reminds me a little bit of my favorite comic, and a guy that I got to know a little bit years ago because I pitched him on an idea for a show, and I saw him for the first time at your Uptown Club up at Young and Egg.
Let me guess. Mitch Hedberg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I adored Mitch Hedberg. I think
so did I.
He was just a beautiful human being and just an amazing comic.
Well, I like those surreal guys. I love Mitch Hedberg. I love Emo Phillips, who I'm very good friends with. In fact, Mitch Hedberg delivered the speech at my wedding.
Really?
I love Gilbert Gottfried.
Mm-hmm.
I love these kinds of acts.
Yeah.
They're not based in reality. They don't need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I just think about Mitch all the time. And over the years, I've heard his voice in so many other young comics. And I think some of them don't even know who he was, but he just reverberated to that extent that he's just part of the comic stratosphere now.
Yeah. Well, there's different genres here we're talking about in subgenres, and the surrealists are one. There's the political comics as well, and I think of them as being Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, and they're telling you what to think.
Yeah,
they're telling you what to think, and that's fine too. I like those guys too, and all the late night hosts, they have a bit of it, right? And then there's the observational guys like Seinfeld, and unfortunately, a lot of bad Seinfeld imitators.
Yeah.
But you know who's good? Tom Papa, who Seinfeld likes. Yeah. Tom Papa's great. I love Tom Papa. And it's not accidental that I like him because he's got these new glasses that he wears that makes him look just like Jack Benny, who's one of my, one of my heroes for sure. But those are three subgenres of comedy. And then there's also the autobiographical comics. This is something I'm not as interested in, but the millennials love this. The comics, they show up and they just tell you what they did that day. It's all kind of miniaturists, and it's got no stagecraft particularly. You feel like you're in your living room or your rec room, and these people are just telling you what's going on, and they're kind of funny. There aren't big punchlines. There aren't big setups. This was interesting to me. I still like stagecraft.
John Mulaney.
Yeah, I love John Mulaney. John Mulaney's great.
That's one of the funnest, most brilliant bits I've heard in a while, because it's all about Trump and he never mentions his name once, is there's a horse in the hospital. And I've listened to that bit so many times and it's just brilliant.
Yeah, he's great. John Mulaney is definitely great.
Well, talking about great comics, talk to me about 2 or 3 comics that you think that the public should be watching out for when things open up. Who's the next big thing?
I don't know. I saw a clip from Esther Koo the other day, and I thought she was fantastic. She's out of the States. She's probably out of Los Angeles. And she does this sort of take off on what you think an Asian comic should be. And I thought she was very postmodern, and I liked her very much. I also hope that Nikki Payne gets back into the business, because I always thought that
I remember seeing her.
She's great. She's studying cultural studies at Dalhousie.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping when she's finished that, she'll be itching to get back on stage for sure. I mentioned Tom Papa, who I'm late to the party on, but I now think he's terrific. Mulaney is a great choice. I think Mulaney's going to be very, very big for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, watch his second Netflix special. It's special. It's truly special.
One thing I was going to mention earlier, these have been difficult times for business owners, entrepreneurs. I was talking to you the other day and telling you that one of the first guests I had on when I started this podcast last year was a friend of mine that I met down here in Costa Rica. Her name is Barbara Holiday. She owns Flappers Comedy Club in Los Angeles. And we had a chat, and it was the beginning of the pandemic. She was stressed out. She was worried about losing her business. And, I don't say this very often, but God bless her, because I'm not really a religious person, but God bless her. She was so worried about her people. And they were doing all kinds of fundraisers, trying to figure out how they could keep the club alive. And also some of their comics who were people who were at risk, some of the, people who might fall through the cracks who didn't have second incomes. And like a lot of comics don't, I think a lot of comics work in other parts of food and beverage industry often, and those things are all gone. And you guys were doing the same sort of thing. You were trying to figure out how to do shows in parks and how to do shows online. Talk to me a bit about the stuff Yuk Yuks has been doing and comedians have been doing to try to keep the art alive and trying to keep people, fed.
Well, remember, I don't just have a club to worry about. I have a whole, vertically integrated company. At our peak, we have 500 employees, coast to coast, if you include all the serving staff and everybody. We're not responsible for each individual franchise. The franchise is responsible. And of course, our fear is that the franchises will just go under. Yeah. We're very lucky that a lot of those franchises are actually part of other businesses so that they've got enough revenue coming in to be able to support it. I'll give you an example. We're in a number of casinos. The casinos are not going to go under. They've got deep pockets and they'll wait it out. And when they're ready to come back, then they'll open up their Yuk Yuks. That's an important thing. We've also transitioned and pivoted a bit. We're doing a lot of cyber comedy. I don't mean Zoom shows, although we're going to try a big one in a couple of weeks, a cross-country one. But I'm talking about mostly corporates, so what we're calling cyber comedy, and we're selling an enormous number of shows to businesses where they no longer have their employees working in an office. They're all working at home. They all feel cut off from each other, and everybody's depressed. And what better way than to say, okay, it's this time on this day, you're going to watch a Yuk Yuks show, and we bring them a Yuk Yuks show that's tapered specifically for their business. We've been doing really well with those. The only problem is, not everybody can do a corporate. This is also before COVID. You have to have a certain ballast to do a corporate. You have to be a certain age to do a corporate, and you can't talk about certain subjects. You can't talk about sex. You can't talk about race. You can't do bathroom humor. No matter how funny those things are, you can't do them. So it restricts the number of people, the kind of people we can book into these shows. And we wish we didn't have to, but there's no choice. To do that, we have to do that. We've also experimented with, drive-in shows. I went to one of the drive-in shows, and the sound is great. The customers in the cars, they tune into whatever frequency it is. They hear it beautifully. The visual is blown up big on a huge screen. That's all great. But what they can't do is they can't have the comics hear the reaction.
Yeah.
And it's just miserable, because what happens is when somebody likes a joke, they're sitting in their car, they honk their horn and they flash their lights.
Yeah.
So it's like being in Cars 2. It's like you're in a Disney movie. It's just bizarre. We're trying something this year. We're actually going to put microphones inside the cars.
You did some park shows. How did those work out?
Park shows are fine. Yeah. Park shows are fine. Outdoor comedy is just fine. There's no problem with it as long as you've got the correct amount of amplification and lighting, and it starts later after the sun has already gone down. There's nothing more depressing than watching comics in the middle of the day. Ooh.
I know. Right? It's like I remember going to see alternative rock shows, or seeing these goth bands or whatever, and the band that had to go on before sundown. A horrible place to be.
No.
In their roster.
Comics are vampires.
Yeah.
They have to be seen at night.
Yeah. The other thing that I'd seen was that there was a documentary that was, about the whole COVID experience. And one of the comments, the comedians was saying that, as part of the regulations, that there was a plexiglass screen in front of the comedian. And, the way the lights are set up, the light would bounce or whatever. You couldn't see the people in the first few rows, or you couldn't see anybody. And you just don't get to gauge how people are reacting to your comedy, and it makes it so much different.
Not just that. You have to spread you're only allowed a certain number of people in the room, a fraction of the people in the room, and you have to spread them out. Now, that what makes comedy exciting is everybody's jammed into a place where they're rubbing shoulders with people. The tighter that you fit them in, the better it is. That's one of the reasons those New York clubs are so great. Space is at such a premium that they literally have people sitting on each other's laps.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. You want it to sweat. You want it to be sweaty. Well, with COVID rules, if we are open, we can't do anything like that. We have to be everybody has to be far from each other. And they're very grateful. The audience is extremely grateful that they're able to see a show, because they probably haven't seen a show of any kind in a long time. But we know, the comics know, the owners know, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. There's not supposed to be a moat between the stage and the audience. This audience is supposed to be right up against the comic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully it won't be that long until that's the case. I think, when will we be fully back where we can actually jam people in? Yeah. That's a year away. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that's a year away. But how long before we can open and, observe all the protocols? That's maybe only 3 months away. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that day. There's two things I miss. I miss seeing comedy. I miss seeing improv, and three things, and live music. I just feel slightly less human without being able to enjoy that with a group. Yeah, listen, me too. Well, my life is my work. I know that, and I've always known that. And without my work, I'm just a shadow of who I really am. I don't get to express myself in the way that I want to express myself. It's important to me. So I can hardly wait till we're back. And I know I speak for everybody. Nobody is saying, yeah, it's been a nice holiday. Nobody is saying that. Oh, sigh. I'll ask you one last question too, and that is, and this is a whole other topic, but you've got so many things that you've got, you got your fingers in so many different pies. You've also been a prolific film critic. Why did you decide I want to do that too? What do you love about that part of your portfolio? Well, first of all, I always loved film. And in fact, I probably loved film before I loved comedy. Even when I was a teenager, I was going to every movie possible. I was almost a completist. Mm-hmm. I don't care what it is. I just like sitting in the dark with strangers. I just like the process of being in the movies. I don't have access to make movies. You need millions and millions of dollars for that, but you can write about them. Mm-hmm. And I think that the column I had with Richard Krause in Metro for those 3 years, I think those were really good columns. It was a real Siskel and Ebert, but I concentrated on trying to make it funny. Yeah. And then there was a change of management, and they went with a more conventional, review the movie. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. I haven't been able to replace that gig yet, but I'm always looking. Yeah. Well, I mentioned to you the other day, I briefly met you once before. We were introduced by my friend Tom Ernst, who was a recent guest on the podcast and who's an old friend of mine. Great guy. And yeah, he's a wonderful person. So I was at a theater in Toronto, and it was for the Toronto premiere of a film called Savages. And I hadn't seen Tom in a long time, and I called out to him, and it was wonderful to see him. I was introduced to yourself and Richard, and we sat and watched the movie with you guys. And so that was the one time I'd met you before, but it was a real pleasure being able to sit down with you today and chat with you about comedy and your amazing career and life in the arts. So I thank you so much for your time. And like I said, I can't wait to get back into one of your clubs, be it if I'm back in Ottawa or at your club in the entertainment district in Toronto, which is it's such a beautiful room to see comedy, really hear comedy. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to it. And so, and I can't wait to go back to Toronto too, because as you know, I'm here in Costa Rica. I might switch off with you. Okay. Come down here for a bit. Is that what you're saying? I might just, want to come down to Costa Rica. It doesn't sound so bad. Yeah. It is beautiful here and stuff, but I'm just, I'm homesick and I miss all that Toronto offers. But as we were chatting earlier before we started the official part of our conversation, Toronto isn't offering what we know is Toronto at this moment. We'll have to wait for it to come back. No, not yet. Yeah. All right, Mark, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely to talk to you, and I really appreciate you sitting down and sharing your story with me. Thank you, David. Be well. There you have it, my conversation with Mark Breslin. Thank you very much to Mark for sharing his cool story. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so by making a small monthly pledge by visiting patreon.com/coolstory with David J. McNeil. Also, thanks again to Mr. Jerry Stamp, who wrote and performed the Cool Story theme song and all other jingles and stings that appear on the show. Do yourselves a favor and look for Jerry's music wherever you stream. And if you like what you hear, visit iTunes and support Jerry by buying an album or two. And finally, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, pura vida.
Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?